Hi everyone. So for this first week, we're going to cover the basics of what is anthropology. So the material in this set of slides matches the material in chapter 1 of the textbook, which is your reading for this week. And, we can't cover everything, but we'll go over the main things together here. So, what's anthropology, right? That's kind of the first basic question, and sometimes people come into the class never having heard of anthropology before, only having a vague idea of what it is. Unlike what a lot of people think, anthropology is not just about the past and looking at old bones. It's really the study of humans as a whole. So, both as biological beings and as cultural beings, because those are both important parts of being human, and from the past to the present. There are a bunch. If you're in social science or commerce, you're taking other social science courses like sociology, psychology, history, economics. You might say, well, these fields study humans too, and different fields take different approaches. Psychologists also take account of biology and culture to a certain extent. Sociology is very similar to the cultural aspects of anthropology, but anthropology distinguishes itself in a couple of ways from those other social sciences. I mean, anthropologists are pretty cool, but other than that, obviously I'm biased. But there are four things that make anthropology unique. And there might be others, but these are the ones that tend to be kind of emphasized in textbooks, notably the textbook we're using. There's a holistic perspective, the comparative approach, the fact that we do field work in all the branches of anthropology, and the evolutionary perspective. So anthropology is evolutionary. So we're going to go look at each of these in a bit more detail. So what's the holistic perspective? Oops, there's a typo. I always catch these when I'm presenting, but there you go. Typos are a part of life. I'll fix it before you get it. So what's the holistic perspective in anthropology? Because you might hear that word holistic sometimes. You often hear it with regards to healing, for example. You might hear about holistic health. And, there's similar meanings. Holistic health is kind of looking at the whole person, not just their physical being, but also all the other aspects of the person and how that affects their health. In anthropology, how we use it is kind of the same ways because everything's interconnected. So, for example, again, biology and culture are very intimately connected. They're not separate things. They, as we're going to see later on, they affect each other. So that's part of the holistic perspective. But also, when we get to the point where we're really focusing on contemporary culture, we look at different aspects of culture and how they're connected with each other. So, for example, things that we might sometimes see as separate parts of life, like family and economics or politics and trade, they're not separate things. They're connected, and it's kind of this web of things that are connected together. And later on in the semester, we'll emphasize that a bit more. And so this is going to come back to haunt us. But for now, it's just important to remember that. The anthropological perspective is holistic in nature. We never look at one thing about humans on its own, right? So even anthropologists who, for example, focus on family systems, they need to take account of all the other things in a society that affect family structure, like the political structure, the economic system, marriage customs, spiritual systems, right? Because everything's connected. So that's one thing about anthropology. One of the other things is the comparative approach. Now, in our everyday lives, sometimes when we talk about comparing things, often it's about assessing which one is better, right? That's not really what comparing is. Really, comparing is looking at both similarities and differences. Okay, so in anthropology, how that manifests is that, in particular, in the cultural anthropology sphere, which we'll talk about soon, where we're looking at different cultures around the world and how they operate, we're looking at similarities and differences between human cultures, not to try to figure out which ones are the best. I mean, we don't do that in anthropology. There's no better cultures. There's no more advanced cultures than others. All cultures have adapted to their environments in their own ways. So none of them are better than others, right? So that's something I'm going to nag you about. That's kind of anti-anthropology thinking right there, is to think that there's some cultures that are better or more progressed or more advanced than others. So when we talk about the comparative approach, then it's to look at, well, how are different cultures similar and how are they different? And some of the things we'll see is that there's such a thing as human universals. For example, marriage exists everywhere. Okay, it's pretty much a human universal. That doesn't mean that everybody in the world gets married. It means that in every culture there exists a concept of marriage. But there's variations in how these universals manifest. Right? So, yes, there are ideas around marriage in every society in the world, just like there are ideas about how to distribute food. There are ideas about gender roles. There's language and systems of communication. These are human universals. They exist everywhere, but they don't look the same everywhere. Okay, so that's what's interesting, is that we can see, oh yeah, everybody in the world needs to make a living somehow. Everybody needs to eat. Everybody needs to sleep. Everybody has concerns about the afterlife and what happens when they die. Everybody is subject to illness. But then how those things are thought about and handled, there's enormous variation. Okay, so that's where the comparative approach comes in, is that we can't really easily make any generalizations based on just looking at one culture, which is what happens often in the West, unfortunately. And a lot of the educational system is based on generalizations that are really based on observations of Western societies and Western histories, which is really problematic, because then that gets projected onto all of humanity, and it's not accurate. Fieldwork is the third thing that's listed as setting anthropologists apart. Now, it's not that people in other fields don't do field work. Some of them do, but it's not always a central part of their work. It's like they can choose to do field work, but it's not necessarily a heavy focus. Whereas in anthropology, if you become an anthropologist, it almost goes without saying that you're going to do some kind of field work. And that means going to gather data directly in the field. Not necessarily like a field like on a farm, but in a location. So if you're an anthropologist that is interested in studying business culture, you're going to go spend time in business settings and do some observations and some interviews. Or a particular community somewhere in the world. It can be close, it can be far. Different kinds of anthropologists fieldwork's going to look different for them. So for anthropologists who are focusing on our biological evolution and prehistoric humans, they're going to be excavating and analyzing fossils. If they're interested in ancient cultures, they're going to be looking at artifacts, so the tools and other things that people made and used to try to reconstruct their culture, right? So they're out there finding information directly and analyzing that information. They're not just reading books or looking at other people's studies. So and there's some examples listed there of different kinds of field work. And finally, that fourth thing that was listed as distinguishing anthropology from other social sciences and other fields is the evolutionary perspective. And again, none of these four things are things that don't exist in other fields. It's just like, this is like this central constellation of things that are an inherent part of anthropology. Whereas in other fields, sometimes they're there, but they don't necessarily have to be, So when we talk about an evolutionary perspective in anthropology, is that we take account that everything changes over time for a variety of reasons. And when we talk about evolution more in coming weeks, we're going to see that a lot of that has to do with adaptation to a specific context. So everything has a historical context in this, and I don't mean history like in your history books, but just, changes over time. So if you look at how the world is today, a bunch of things had to happen to lead to things being the way that they are now. And that applies to both our biological beings as humans and the cultural aspects of being human. All right, they all have a track record, and everything has a local context. So meaning that those changes that have happened, they were adapted to specific contexts and particular places. So if you look at what people are doing in a certain part of the world, you can take into account, well, okay, well, this is what the landscape has looked like. These are some environmental changes that have happened that people had to adapt to. So this makes sense there, even if in the context you're in, it wouldn't make any sense at all. So, your textbook explains things a little bit differently. My explanations here are meant to kind of complement those of the textbook and help you think about things in different ways. So don't panic if you're like, this wording is not in the textbook, okay? So a few concepts that we can highlight that are going to come back throughout the semester. So they're important to highlight here as they are highlighted in that first chapter. One is the concept of culture. So, culture, I think, everybody's heard the term culture. A lot of people use it. People use it in their daily life. It sometimes means different things to different people. And when we're talking about the concept of culture, just culture, not a culture, but just culture in general. We're not talking about any one specific one here, but just what is a culture. We're talking if you look at different anthro textbooks, you'll see a million different definition. But one that I like to use and that kind of touches on a whole bunch of them is this very simple way of expressing it. Is like it's a set of learned beliefs and practices that are shared by a group. And, when we talk about culture in more detail, we'll break that down a little bit. Like, okay, learned, and this is already in chapter 1 where you learn it. It's like we don't rely on instinct as a lot of other animals do, right? Most of our behaviors are learned. We learn them through observation and trial and error rather than having these instinctive reactions to things. And they feel instinctive, but really at some point we kind of learned them. Beliefs and practices, I like that because it really refers to everything that we think and everything that we actually do. So I put belief here, but that includes what we think we know about the world, what we think we know about ourselves, and all the things that we do, work, play, have sex, whatever. And this set of learned beliefs and practices, they're shared by a group. So things that you do as an individual might be influenced by one or more cultures. But if you're the only one that has this specific constellation of beliefs and practices, that's your own individual thing. We're really talking about the ones that are shared by a group. And that doesn't need to be a country or, an entire province or things like that, because sometimes we mix up culture and nation. There can be a national culture of things that are shared, but within that there can be smaller groupings of culture, right? So it's a complex kind of multi-use term. And under here I put biocultural because of the approach that we take, again, that holistic approach that we take in anthropology. It's always important to remember that culture is not separate from biology. Okay, so the capacity for culture comes from our biological makeup. We'll see that in more detail when we talk a bit more about evolution in the weeks to come. But over time, what happened physically to humans has a lot to do with our brain capacity and the capacity for symbolic thinking that allows us to be cultural beings. So we wouldn't have culture without the biological adaptations that have happened over the past millions of years. But we're also not just driven by biology. Culture actually affects our biology, and that's another thing that we'll see when we talk about evolution. So, and that continues today because the way our cultures are set up often affect how people physically adapt to a certain environment, either in their lifetime or even over generations. So the biocultural is kind of one aspect of the holistic approach where we're really looking at how things are intertwined together. Sometimes we want to put things in boxes, especially in Western culture, there's this thing of like putting everything into boxes as though they were separate things. But really, that's not how humans are. That's not how the world is. The world doesn't conform to the boxes that we create for it. So, other concepts that are touched on in this chapter, but that will come back throughout the semester, and these are important ones because in anthropology there's an older history in anthropology that is discussed a little bit in chapter 1, and I suggest that you do have a look at it because it's important to know that background, because anthropology hasn't always been, there have been some problems, and a big part of it came out because anthropology came into existence at a time when there were people, particularly in Western Europe, who were coming up with these so-called scientific explanations for the differences that they were seeing between peoples. And one thing that came out of that is that there was a belief that emerged that you could group people by race. Now, we'll talk about this again, but race is a biological concept and it does exist in a lot of other animal species, but not among humans. It's not, again, we can't put people into boxes that way because human variation at the genetic level is so complex and complicated that there's no real way to draw those kinds of boundaries between groups of people. Okay? We'll talk about that more. But unfortunately, that was a very strong belief for a long time, and some people still believe it, even some anthropologists, to be honest. But the majority of anthropologists agree that there's no scientific basis for the existence of races among humans, biologically speaking. As we know, it's still a strong belief among many in the population, so racism does still exist because there's this idea that races are still a social or cultural concept. So even if they don't exist biologically, if people perceive them to exist, then they'll act on that belief. Okay? So, so racism comes into play where you have this set of, it's kind of like a cultural attribute in a sense. Sometimes it can be built into a culture or a society where you have these ideas and practices that are associated not only with the idea that there are races, but that some of those racial groups are superior to others. And this can be overt or covert, meaning people can be just kind of in your face about their racism, or sometimes it's kind of hidden. It can be intentional or unintentional. So sometimes people are racist, but not on purpose, but just because they're participating in a system that is racist. And then we get into that individual or systemic thing, which is a big debate right now, right? With if you've been paying attention to the news. So again, this will all come up, but this is an important part of learning about anthropology because a lot of anthropology helps debunk these beliefs, but you have to want to debunk them. Right? If somebody comes into an anthropology class and they have racist beliefs, they have to want to change those beliefs. If they cling to them, then none of this is going to change anything for them. So, anyway, it's something that we'll talk about. It's not always an easy topic, and as a teacher who is white, I'm very well aware that a lot of my students have much more lived experience with this than I do as people who are subject to racism. I have never been subject to racism, but I am part of a racist system, which is our society. We'll talk about that again. So, subfields of anthropology. So, this is, there are a lot of in any field, there are a lot of different branches, right? And in anthropology, we call those branches subfields, and there are many of them, but typically in an intro course, we talk about the four main ones. And this is a North American approach to anthropology. If you go to like France, for example, to them, anthropology is social and cultural anthropology, and all the biological stuff is a whole other thing. So these are interesting cultural differences. But here, there's very much that four-field approach. So let's have a look at the main subfields of anthropology. Don't panic if you can't see this graph very well. It's copied from the textbook, page 5, okay? So you can look at it when you read the chapter. You'll see it in more detail. And you see that there are these four subfields: cultural anthropology, biological, linguistic anthropology, archaeology. These are the four main fields, and you see them in these blue squares here. And they each have their own specialty. And in the middle, you have some others, and we can talk about those a bit later, but we won't go into detail. They're kind of like other subfields, but that take information from the four main ones. Okay, so they're kind of, they crisscross. So, what's biological anthropology? Well, the word biological kind of says it. When I was, in school, in anthropology school, doing my bachelor's, at the time it was called physical anthropology, and that terminology has changed. And sometimes I might accidentally say physical because that's my training, but what I mean is biological anthropology. And the word kind of says it all. There's a focus on the biological roots and nature of humans. And even within that, there's subfields. A lot of these subfields have subfields within them. So, for example, one thing we'll touch on a little bit in this course is primatology, and that's the study of the similarities and differences between us and non-human primates. So, if you didn't already know, we're very closely related to chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, monkeys, right? So they're our closest living relatives in the animal kingdom. And so the idea is that we're all part of this group called primates, and that's within the animal kingdom. And, by looking at similarities and differences between us and our closest relatives, we can kind of get some ideas about our own roots within the animal kingdom. Both at the biological and cultural level, because there are signs of rudimentary culture among some of our closest relatives, and it's actually pretty cool. So we'll touch on that. Paleoanthropology, this is the field that usually people associate with anthropology, right? So this kind of digging up ancient fossils, so bones and, teeth, and, you see these images of old skulls, right? So that's kind of within the domain of paleoanthropology, and it's fascinating. And, when you hear about ancient humans like Homo erectus and Neanderthals and many, many others, this is the purview of paleoanthropologists, and we'll definitely touch on that because their work helps us understand our biological and cultural origins, because again, culture is rooted in our biology. And there are other kind of subfields that they don't always have names as such, but biological anthropologists, some of them focus on contemporary genetic distribution throughout the human population and how that's adaptive to specific environments, and how it touches on thousands and millions of years of evolution, and that can be connected to all kinds of medical things as well, like predisposition to certain illnesses and so on, so forth. Cultural anthropology, that's kind of, one of a big chunk of our course is going to be spent in this area, where, cultural anthropologists focus on cultural similarities and another typo, not in differences, and differences between societies. So, as I mentioned earlier, that's from this holistic perspective where everything is connected within a culture, but also to understand, well, what do we do the same, and how do we do it differently across cultures? So, getting and distributing food within a community, organizing our societies, who has power over who, the effects of colonization and globalization on cultures around the world, and a whole bunch of other things. And in your textbook, they have a few related terms. I'm not talking about all of them here because that would be almost a whole set of slides on its own, but one that's going to come up often for us is ethnography. And that's, when we talked about field work earlier, ethnography has a double sense. So it's the study of a culture. So through field work, when a cultural anthropologist goes and spends time in a community, usually months, years even sometimes, learning about the way of life or some specific aspects by, hanging out and participating in the culture and interviewing people. But ethnography is also the word for the thing that gets written about that after, or filmed or something. So it's the documentation as well. So that's a term that's going to come up from time to time because a lot of the knowledge in cultural anthropology comes from ethnographic studies. Linguistic anthropology is a fascinating field on its own. Linguistics is kind of its own field. So then there's this, like, so linguistic anthropology is kind of a subfield of anthropology but also of linguistics, so it's kind of this crossover here. And it's the study of human languages, but not in the sense of like learning a language, right? Although linguists tend to wind up learning a lot of languages, but it's language can be defined as a symbolic system of communication. You'll see different definitions for language. It's something we all use all the time in one way or another, whether we speak it or write it or use sign language or all kinds of ways of communicating. Linguistic anthropology also touches on other forms of communication like body language and other symbolic systems. So in linguistic anthropology, there's a particular interest on the origins and evolution of language. So again, our capacity for language is biological in a couple of ways. We have the mouth, jaw, and throat structure that allows for speaking a certain way, again, in general. And there's a part of our brain that allows us to think symbolically, right? Because words are symbols, they represent something. And humans decide what those meanings are. Linguistic anthropologists are interested in changes in language over time, which is, again, really fascinating because you can look at how different languages are connected with each other when you talk about these big language families and things like that. The relationship between language, culture, and worldview. There's so much cultural information that is stored in a language. So when we talk about endangered languages that are dying out, those are human experiences and bundles of knowledge that humanity has already lost and is still in the process of losing because of languages that are dying out. So at the level of humanity, it's very sad, and it's a huge loss when we lose all that knowledge. And language revitalization, because of that threat, in languages that are endangered right now, and sometimes there are very few speakers left. There are people who are mobilizing to try to kind of maintain and revitalize their ancestral languages, which is a beautiful thing and shows that humans are very resilient. Finally, archaeology, the fourth main subfield, and some people sometimes have heard of archaeology because of, Tomb Raider or Indiana Jones or things like that, and, as with everything Hollywood or, media, mainstream media related, often there are misrepresentations of what things are. Hopefully you know that by now, that you can't trust everything you see on TV or on the internet. So, sometimes people have heard of archaeology, but they don't realize that it's a subfield of anthropology, which is normal. But it is, because it's the study of ancient humans through the remains of their material culture. And what material culture is objects, right? So the things that we use, the thing that I'm using to film this right now and the thing that you're using to listen to this is part of our shared material culture. Pens, headphones, phones, right? Material culture. And so ancient humans had material culture as well, the things that they used. And when we consider it to be material culture if it's an object that was made by humans or modified. So sometimes in the ancient records you see, maybe you've already learned about ancient stone tools, for example. And very often they were, rocks that were modified. Okay, and interestingly, earlier I said that some of our closest relatives have some elements of culture. Well, you see that with, chimps who can take a branch and strip the twigs off of it and use the branch to dig for termites or ants in the ground. That's a tool. So you're taking something, you're modifying it so that you can use it. So that's material culture. is basically our stuff. Okay? And so archaeologists look at that stuff, and including ancient remains of structures like fireplaces or cemeteries, but a lot of times ancient garbage heaps, which, yield pieces of pottery or other things that people made or modified. And they try to kind of reconstruct what, given that and given the environment that existed at the time, they can kind of try to piece together what these cultures looked like. So obviously they often work with paleoanthropologists because especially if they're dealing with very ancient humans like Homo erectus, for example. And also, archaeologists increasingly, as their cultural sensitivity is increasing, they'll often pay attention to the oral histories of local peoples. So, for example, here in North America, a lot of the archaeology that happens has to do with the ancestors of today's indigenous peoples. And so indigenous peoples today still have very old stories that document things that happened hundreds and thousands of years ago. So piecing that together with what archaeologists can find can be very helpful in reconstructing these ancient societies. Plus, it's less problematic to do it that way because then they're taking into account of local knowledge in a way that archaeologists in the past didn't necessarily do because they didn't see oral histories as a valid source of knowledge. So, as I mentioned earlier, and as you can see on the chart on page 5 of the textbook, those are the 4 main subfields, but there are others, and I'm listing a couple of here, but there are others mentioned in the textbook that kind of intersect with the 4 main ones. Third typo that I found here, main ones. So applied anthropology is, kind of a direct application of anthropological knowledge to solve contemporary problems. So, there's something going on somewhere where there's maybe a conflict between 2 different populations, or there's a population that's kind of in conflict with their own government or something like that. Anthropologists can sometimes, be useful in the sense of applying some things that we know about humanity to these specific problems, and that draws on all the subfields, or some of them. Same with medical anthropology. I mean, if you are interested in health and healing, and maybe you're going into some form of medical practice, medical anthropology can really help bring in a new perspective, because instead of just relying on Western medical knowledge, medical anthropologists can kind of help bring in perspectives from different cultures, but also look at the environment that a situation is taking place in and kind of have that holistic approach and look at all the different things that are contributing, both at the biological level but also at the cultural level, to a particular health problem. So what's the point? Just to wrap this up, what's the point of learning about all this? Well, I firmly believe that even if you don't plan on becoming an anthropologist or even any kind of social scientist, you can benefit from having an anthropological perspective. As an individual, it can give you adaptability. So if you take on the curious and openness of an anthropologist, when you travel, when we're allowed to travel again, and it's safe to travel again, you can travel, and then the things that produce that feeling of culture shock, it'll still be there, right? You can't really completely avoid that, but you'll have a maybe different reaction to it. It'll be unsettling, but maybe you'll be excited about it instead of judgmental. In your work, I mean, no matter what work you do, you will encounter people who have a different cultural background and different practices than you. And instead of having a knee-jerk reaction and judging their way of doing things as automatically wrong and inferior to yours, you might be able to work with them to kind of try to find a way to work together. So again, if you're in the healing professions, your patients that you deal with, or as a teacher, your students, anybody that you work with in any capacity, it doesn't matter what you do for a living, this will be useful. And your personal relationships, your life is much more interesting if you're capable of forming friendships with people who have a different cultural background and a different way of seeing the world, and that can only be enriching. And having that kind of openness, again, to not judge how things are done elsewhere. Okay. compassion and an ability to see things from other perspectives. So, you know, less racism and prejudice in society in general is a good thing. And again, if you that only happens if you're willing to kind of change a worldview, you know. And I realize that a lot of people growing up in an urban context like Montreal, where, you know, from elementary school onwards, you're exposed to so many different people, so it might seem like, oh, well, no, you know, I'm not racist, or, well, you know, everybody has some kind of prejudice. It's not always malicious. It's just something that, you know, and sometimes we internalize things about our own group of people, and you know, there's all kinds of little things that happen, even if we're, you know, we're good people and we don't want to be, you know, oppressive. There's always these little things that seep into our brain because of popular media and because of education. For example, most of my students are non-Indigenous, and they have these misconceptions about Indigenous peoples that I try to debunk. And again, it's not out of maliciousness, but this is what a lot of you have been exposed to in, you know, through Hollywood and through high school, which is, you know, that topic is really not handled well in most high schools. So this is something that anthropology can help with to a certain extent, if you wanted to. And finally, critical thinking towards, say, government policies and actions. And, you know, I mean, sometimes anywhere in the world, like, governments kind of take on certain powers and stuff like that. And I'm not saying, oh, you need to kind of revolt and anything, but when you look at a policy, having an anthropological perspective can sometimes help see what's problematic about this policy, this government policy, or this law. How does it contribute to treating some people less fairly than others? So, and just critical thinking in general is a good thing, and that's part of the CEGEP mandate, is helping to create critical thinkers who can actively engage with society. So that's kind of our intro. I'm hoping that this course will contribute this to your life and enrich your engagement as, you know, social citizens. Now and going into life, even if you don't remember all the concepts from this course after, hopefully the perspectives will be helpful to you. So don't be shy if you have any questions, and we'll talk about this in Thursday's discussion, where you're going to come with all your questions and comments and observations, and it'll be great. I'll see you then.